Well, hello there, and thank you very much for clicking on this video today. So, prisons in the UK are very much a topic of conversation. But unfortunately, what is not a big topic of conversation, and something that the Independent, which I'm using as a source for this particular video, has been campaigning on for a long time, is the hidden injustice of indefinite jail terms. Jail terms which sentence mostly exclusively young men to decades in prisons, which have been ruled as completely unjust. And in fact, the prison sentences themselves have been completely removed from the statute book. But those people were never released, and it's only until relatively recently that they were. And so, as I always do, I am posting a link, to the actual article that I'm taking this from the Independent, which goes into all of the detail, which goes into all of it. But let's delve into it. So at the start, it says, Jerry Talbot was a 14-year-old when he used an imitation firearm to rob someone over their mobile phone, a silver Nokia worth £190, in what was described as his 2007 trial as an unremarkable but serious crime. Despite the age and nature of his offence, the judge decided that the child in the dock, he was 15 at the time, was dangerous and sentenced him to a draconian indefinite jail term, which has since been abolished by the statute books. And one thing to bear in mind about indefinite jail terms is these were jail terms which you could not get out. There was no official end date. In most jail terms, you get a start and you get an end. Sometimes people don't always serve all of their time, but you get an end anyway. And these were not the case in these indefinite jail terms. And so, two decades later, Talbot was still in custody. So 20 years after the fact of his jail term, he was jailed, and after the law itself had been abolished and taken away, he was still there, sat in jail, and that was until the Court of Appeal this year ruled that the punishment was obviously wrong. And what they had to say about it was this: it would appear that Talbot's sentence was in effect, a life sentence by a judge who did not appreciate that he was dealing with a 15-year-old defendant. The panel of judges led by Lord Justice Edis said in a scathing judgment, which concluded that the sentencing process was unacceptable and the results has been unjust. 20 years for what this guy did, basically a robbery with an imitation firearm, is insane. People that commit quite serious sexual assaults or offences are not jailed as much as this guy was. And as we'll see, he's not alone. Quite a lot of other, mostly young men, actually pretty much exclusively young men, were jailed for insane amount of times for crimes that are, sure, they are serious, but they do not need 20 years. So Talbot's case is one of 6 imprisonment for public protection, IPP, and its youth equivalent, detention for public protection, DPP, in jail terms. These were quashed in a sweeping ruling because the courts had failed to take into account the offender's age and immaturity. Yes, and we know that male brains, the biology of male brains, we know now that most men don't really mature properly until they're in their early to mid-20s. This guy at the top, let's say at the top of this article, he was 14 when he did this. For 20 years for a crime that he did when he was 14? I don't know, that's not right. So, another offender, Jay Davis, had served the best part of 20 years in custody for threatening someone with a pellet gun when he was 19. He should have received an 18-month determinate sentence, the Court of Appeals has found. In his case was flagged by the country's miscarriage of justice watchdog, the Criminal Cases Review, which is now reviewing more than 180 cases, with more applications arriving every week. So there are hundreds of these cases, potentially. It's an insane miscarriage of justice. Its chair, Dame Vera Baird, revealed it is time the government takes wholesale action to review or resentence those serving the controversial jail terms. I think we are increasingly seeing a lot of men who were sentenced when they were young and have had terrible miscarriages of justice imposed upon them, she said to The Independent. Now, one thing to bear in mind is this week, Prime Minister Andy Burnham announced his government would do just that, ordering a review of jail terms as a way of tackling Britain's prison issues and freeing up much needed space in Britain's overcrowded prison. So this move was welcomed by the former Lord Chief Justice John Thomas, who said that sentences were a stain on the justice system, while Labour peer Shami Chakrabarti said that Mr Burnham's intervention would offer hope for the helpless. So Dame Vera welcomed the move, but called for the CCRC, which she said was reviewing as many cases as possible as quickly as we can, to the Court of Appeal to be involved in the review. So the open-ended sentence, which the Independent notes it's been campaigning against for more than 2 years to have reviewed, were outlawed in 2012, but not retrospectively, and that's the key. These guys were sat there in jail even though these sentencing guidelines were outlawed and abandoned, and introduced them to New Labour, of course, in a bid to be tough on crime, which is the stupidest thing. I get so sick of this. We shouldn't be quote-unquote tough on crime, we should be smart on crime. Because here's the thing, jails can only do in the UK can only really do one thing. They can hold people for a certain amount of time. That's it. And we spend very little time, energy, and resources into things like rehabilitation, and we wonder why we have, reoffending rates that we do. So one thing to mention here is that in a bid to get tough on crime, they were handed to many repeat offenders, even if the crimes were minor, which is in of itself stupid. Like, I appreciate that I appreciate that if you have repeat offenders, that is a real problem. But if their most recent crime was relatively minor, then I don't think that they deserve to be an indefinite prison term anyway. The idea was that criminals would only be released when they could prove to a parole board that they no longer pose a risk to the public. Well, that is itself a major problem. How exactly do you prove that you're not a problem? Exactly. You can say what you like to a parole board, but there's a very good chance that they won't believe you, especially if you've got a serious criminal past record. So that in itself is a problem. And also, that completely ignores the fact that in order to prevent recidivism, to prevent people from reoffending once they get released, you actually need resources to actually rehabilitate people. That's what countries that have better recidivism rates than us do. Norway has the best recidivism rate in the world, or the lowest reoffending rate in the world. It's about 20%, with recidivism rates based on the reconviction of within 2 years. For the preparation for this kind of video, I looked that up. And it's not just them, countries like the Netherlands as well have low rates. Quite a lot of other countries do, and one thing that you find when you look at kind of how that's been achieved is an emphasis on rehabilitation, not on punishment. And we can blame politicians as much as we like, and they deserve that blame when it comes to these indefinite sentences. But the public also deserve blame as well, because it's not as though these draconian sentences were not done in an attempt to basically appease the public. And that is why, when it comes to our prison problems in general, outside the fact of building more prisons, which is in itself expensive, we have a real problem that a lot of the British public just don't want to listen to the evidence and the facts. We shouldn't be imposing draconian sentences on people. We should be looking to countries that have been able to achieve better results than we have and looking at what they're doing, going, that's interesting. How do they do that? And taking ideas from it and saying, let's try and implement these. Let's do some testing here. Let's trial run some of these ideas for ourselves in our own prison and see what the results is. I don't really see how we can get much worse. And if we can get good results, let's implement them. If Norway can do it, then I don't see why we can't. So, to continue with this. So, unfortunately, more than 2,700 under 25s, including 1,495 under 21s, 17 children under 14, and even a 10-year-old, oh Christ, were among those who found themselves locked up without a release date. And some 14 years after the sentences were recognised as a mistake, almost 2,400 IPP and DPP prisoners remain incarcerated. Some have served up to 22 times their original minimum term. This is a disgrace, an absolute disgrace. While others are in a vicious cycle of recall, often for breaches of stricter licence conditions, but the campaigning group United Group for the Reform of IPP says the growing number of sentences now being quashed exposes a devastating reality. An entire generation of young men were written off by the state. Dame Vera, who was appointed as the chair of the CCRC last summer, was the Labour MP for Redcar when the sentences were first being introduced in 2005. Even then, she thought the project was a risky manoeuvre. But who could expect that it would last this long and cause so much damage, which I'm afraid it has done. I would shed a bit of criticism on her, not just on her specific, but on the Labour politicians of that era. This was actually, when you look at the details of what these indefinite sentences actually were and are, it actually seems like a very easy problem that could occur. Personally, I don't think you need to be a genius to work it out. But she then goes on to say, it's very odd that we're left over with a lot of people who are still stuck on something that we all accept should never have been implemented. So, it then goes on to say that despite 96 prisoners taking their own lives in custody after losing hope of ever getting out, successive governments have resisted calls to resentence those still on a jail term. But a landmark ruling in the case of Leighton Williams, who served nearly 16 years over a drunken fight aged 19, has opened the floodgates. The appeal court ruled that previous offences committed when he was 17 had been wrongly counted against him, and that his IPP sentence was quashed in 2024. Following his release, he told The Independent this was an unjust jail term that robbed him of 16 formative years. Since then, a flurry of cases have been referred to the Court of Appeal and have been overturned, including that of Harun Ahmed, who spent 18 years being punished for a knife-point robbery of a service station he committed when he was 19. After it was quashed last year, he compared the plight of IPP prisoners to hostages, adding, we have grown from teenagers to men, and we're watching people with much worse offending come to custody and being released. Which, yeah, absolutely. Even if you seem to think that what these guys did was inexcusable, the fact that, as he points out, people who've done much worse things have basically been jailed and released is in of itself inexcusable. So the CCRC now has a dedicated team examining applications from the IPP and DWT prisoners. Recently, it's referred its 11th case this year to the appeal courts. Even with a streamlined process, progress is slow, and revisiting every outstanding case would take another CCRC, Dame Vera admitted. Because this is huge. Like there are potentially thousands of people that are sat in prison over this, so it's going to take a long time at this current rate to get to basically hear these appeals. The more we take notice of IPPs and the more we refer IPPs, the more IPPs we get sent into us for review, she said. I think really something far more wholesale needs to be done than this kind of pedaling along at a slow bicycle's pace. So in 2022, the Cross-Party Justice Committee inquiry found that sentences were irredeemably flawed and called for all IPP prisoners to be resentenced. Lord Thomas has also taken up the issue, urging parliamentarians to give prisoners a release date in a major report published with the Howard League for Penal Reform. And a damning statement last month, the UN condemned the detention of UK prisoners trapped on IPP terms as arbitrary and accused the British government of presiding over a form of psychological torture. In a scathing 16-page document, the Human Rights Council Working Group on Arbitrary Detention said that sentences amounted to inhumane treatment due to the mental anguish of being subjected to continuous uncertainty over a release date. Dame Vera, a former victims commissioner, said that she was not surprised the UN was looking at the scandal, adding it was the time for each case to be reviewed and systematically individually while ensuring the public is protected. Literally, some of these guys don't even know if they're ever going to get out for what they did, she said. Fundamentally, the government accepted a long time ago these sentences were unwise. So if the government has said these are bad sentences, surely it needs to devise a way of getting those who are left over off them. So a spokeswoman for these prisoners, but for the organisation that is representing the interests of these prisoners, welcomed Mr. Byrne's review, but said they had heard promises of action and reform before, only seen meaningful change delayed or failed to materialise. They called for an urgent resentencing exercise, adding the government cannot continue to outsource its moral responsibility to an under-resourced court system, which is true. Our court system is under-resourced, which is why at its current pace, it could take many more decades for these people to basically be released. She said, "We need urgent state-led action through a proper resentencing exercise to finally give those written off young adults their lives back." The Ministry of Justice spokesperson said it is right that IWP sentences were abolished, the decision to quash these individual sentences a matter for the courts, but it isn't. Or not purely. This was a political decision made just to get good headlines in the newspapers the next day. That's exactly what this was. An exercise in the most desperate attempts for popularity. So the government should unilaterally release these people. For God's sake, many of these people have been in jail for nearly 20 years. They should be released, because what they did does not warrant the amount of time that they spent in jail. It's as simple as that. So, this is a lot. So let's try and summarize. Let's try and summarize as best we can for all this information that's been gathering. So, kudos to the Independent. They have been looking at this and speaking about this for quite some years. One of the few kind of media outlets, or more sort of mainstream or large media outlets, to really take up this injustice. I mean, bear this in mind, as they say, more than 2,700 people under 25 were jailed with this, including 1,495 under 21s and 17 children under 11. Even a 10-year-old, a fucking 10-year-old, was basically locked up without a release date. It's no wonder many of these prisoners have killed themselves, because basically they have no hope. And when it comes to the idea that, oh well, if you take away the release date, that will give people basically an incentive to prove themselves. We have seen what the legacy of that kind of thinking is. Many of these prisoners have in fact killed themselves because they have no hope. The hope of ever getting out has been crushed, and so they took their own lives. It doesn't really understand how human psychology works. If you put people into despair with no hope of getting out, and their only hope being, oh well, you have to prove that you're not a danger to the community, even though your past like, how do you do that? How does anyone prove that you're not a danger to the community? You can only go by your past record, and if you're someone that does have a record of a crime, then it's very difficult to do so. I have seen some commentary about this, of people going, oh well, you know, this indefinite sentence idea was okay in theory, but just the practicalities of it didn't work out. No. This was a terrible idea from its inception. This was nothing more than a cheap way to buy some good press by going, no, we're getting tough on criminals. We're going to sentence 10-year-olds to indefinite jail sentences. Maybe he'll never get out. Isn't that fair? Isn't that justice? No, of course it isn't. That's completely bonkers. It's wacko. It's loodle-doodle. You have to suffer brain damage to think that the 10-year-old getting an indefinite jail sentence was appropriate. And condemnation on the judge who did that, and condemnation on all of the judges, actually, that resigned common sense when it comes to these indefinite jail sentences, because they didn't have to implement them if they didn't want to. This was an obvious problem right from the get-go, and the fact that it's only taken until now, until it's to be recognised, and for anything to be done about it, is an indictment on our jail prison system in general. It's kind of an indictment on us as well as a society, because it's demonstrated that actually, as much as we talk about justice and wanting to get justice for the victims and things like that, that's actually not really what we're interested about. We're just interested about punishment and jailing people for a long time as possible, because we seem to think that will somehow solve the problems. Again, British jails are basically just vast warehouses where you dump people for a certain amount of time. We can see from what other countries have done, like Norway, I hate to bring it up, but I will do, because you can't argue the facts, and the fact of the matter is they have very good recidivism rates. 20% is the best in the world. And we should look to countries like that and go, let's, as I said earlier, let's do what they're doing. Let's try and emulate that. Let's not look at crap and try and emulate crap. Let's look at things that actually work and try and emulate that. Wouldn't that be a good idea? But anyway, thank you very much for listening on my little rant today. I hope you have a good day wherever you are, and I will catch you in the next video. So you know what? You have a good day wherever you are. Bye bye.